Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming at you again live from Film Fanatic headquarters. I hope everyone's doing good. It is Tuesday, or actually no, it's Wednesday at 8:18, or actually 9:18 in the morning. It's a Tuesday morning. Another relatively normal winter day here in the mid coast. Pretty warm out actually. So I hope everyone's doing good. Always love to give a shout out to the people who come by and check out this page, and the news. Always love to welcome the new subscribers. Really appreciate that, and people commenting on videos. That's always a lot of fun interacting with other fellow film fanatics, because that's what it's all about. So yeah, I did my first podcast last week. It was on Sunday. It's the first time I ever was a guest on someone's show. Matthew Littlefield, who's a super cool guy. He's a local uh, guy in the area here in Maine. He lives, I think, right in the Belfast area. He is an interesting dude because we met years and years ago through. He's also a musician, and he's a bass player, and we had played a couple of gigs together, and we played a gig like 20 years ago together, and then I don't know, many years later we ended up playing another show, and we kind of like briefly like saw each other once in a while, once in a blue moon, and then a couple of years ago I ended up becoming friends with him on Facebook, and I saw that he was doing lots of different creative things. And one of the things that he was doing was he started doing a podcast. And I remember listening to it a few times, and it was really cool. He had different guests on there. They would talk about a lot of the stuff initially that I saw was centered around films, and he would usually get together with like one or two of his friends or just him, and he would pick one particular movie, and one for instance that really stood out. One show in particular was he did a show on my favorite John Carpenter movie, The Thing, from 1982, and he talked about his experience, watching it when it was at the time back in the day when it was, a newer film, or when he saw it when he was a kid, and then he said he watched it recently with like his kids and his family during that time, and basically wanted to do a show on to see, if this movie was, now dated, watching it as an older man and watching it after, all the experience that you have of seeing movies, and just he wanted to see if this movie still holds up and if it was still, kind of one of the greatest horror movies ever made. And he said that it was still like a real riveting experience, and it totally held up. And so that was like the first podcast I saw of his. And then I saw that he's done a few other shows. He does a lot of creative things. He does karaoke or trivia nights. He still plays music. He does a lot of variable, lots of lots of variety of different things. And I noticed on his podcast, it wasn't just movies. He did all kinds of things. He did, reviews about, or talks about, you know, local artists or people who were involved in the community. Some somewhat social, political commentary on certain things, national or local. He mixed it up. It was a really cool podcast, and I was a guest on his show on Sunday, and that was my first time ever being a guest on someone's show. So it was fun. It was. I was pretty nervous at first, just because I've never done that before. I have my only experience with that kind of thing is doing the interviews here that I do on Film Fanatic, where I have a guest on, and I've done it. I've done it quite a few times, and it's something that out of the things that I do for this channel, it's it's probably the most enjoyable thing that I do. I really love having guests on the show, and that's been something I've been trying to pursue more, and to try to dive into more. dive into just as a whole. But my experience, so that was really my only experience with doing live video or live audio, and then having it uploaded. So it was cool. One of the things that we really talked a lot about on that show was, I mean, we talked about music, and we talked about kind of how we met 20 some odd years ago, and it was a really funny story all around that because of the nature of the gig. But the main focus of the show was, we talked about this channel and the movie stuff I do, and so it was very cool. But one of the movies that we really talked a lot about, we spent a little bit more time discussing, was John Carpenter's The Thing, and that's like easily my favorite John Carpenter movie. It's we discussed on the podcast how you know usually for most people and most of the time when someone comes up to you and says, "Oh, like what's your favorite band or what's your favorite movie of all time, your favorite director or even like what's the best movie you think you've seen this year?" So that can be always a tricky thing, because people's tastes kind of change over time. You get turned on to lots of different things on the way, or there's certain things you might have liked at one time and they don't really, I don't know, they don't really hold up to you for you anymore. Certain and that can be, or something that you've listened, like say for instance for an album, it might be a band that you've just checked out, and you might have that experience of where you heard them in the in the background, or you've heard a couple of their songs, but you never really, I don't know, you didn't really uh, really seek it out, or it didn't move you at that time, and you didn't really gravitate towards it. And then maybe later on, you'll have that experience, and you'll be like, "Wow, this is incredible," and you'll be, you become a full fledged fan of that music. And the same thing happens all the time. I think it happens with anything really. It's particularly anything in the arts. But that happens a lot for me for films. Certain movies that I liked, maybe years ago when they first came out, and I'd seen them a couple times, and then later on I see them and I'm like, you know what? I don't know what I was thinking. This movie really is kind of piss poor. I don't know what. And then you kind of you're at this different place, and maybe your tastes have changed, or and it's just not your thing anymore, and vice versa. Something you saw that you thought was pretty good, but then time goes by, and then you see it again, and then before you know it, you're like, wow, this really was an awesome movie, or this really is an awesome movie, and then you become a full fledged fan. I mean, like two real big examples for me, and they're all like pretty recent examples of that. One would be one example would be like in the music world. Um, I've talked a lot about music and things related to music and how they're tied to film for me. Just in my own taste, uh, or more so directly related to the music that I write. But like I've always said, I love all kinds of music. Electronic music is probably my favorite music of all time. I always kind of go to that. I always talk about my favorite band, Autechre, a British duo who, for me, they're just like musical gods, and I, kind of worship at their feet. Um, but I also, am a huge fan of hip hop and rap. I grew up in New York in the the 80s and 90s, so like all of that stuff was around me. Public Enemy, KRS-One, and you know all of that classic hip hop and music that was coming out. Nas, the first album, Illmatic, which is like my favorite hip hop album of all time. So I've always been a huge fan of hip hop and rap, and but I reached a little point in my life where I wasn't really, I don't know, checking out a lot of new stuff in the rap and hip hop world. And I know the world has, like, with anything, has changed and evolved so quickly. And there's so many other bands, so many other groups and artists doing, those respective genres. but for whatever reason, I never really dove into or spent time checking out a lot of new stuff. Every now and then, I would hear artists that I like, or there's been a small group of artists that now I really really love that are newer artists. But there was a time when I just, for some reason, I was just kind of, when I was listening to that kind of music, I was always going back to the old school stuff. And there was one band I remember, somebody who was actually who's actually a drummer also and a musician, really great drummer. This guy Paul Bassi. I remember it was like probably 8 years ago now. It was a long time ago. I at one point I was in the same circle with him with certain musicians, and I would run into him every now and then, and we would, sometimes our bands would kind of play together on the same bill, and we just had this little thing where we were in this little for a brief time in this little pool or social circle for a while. So I was around him a lot. But I remember one of the times I saw him, and I haven't talked with him in a few years, but he had really great taste in music. He always had a real eclectic taste in music, and he I remember talking to him about music one day, and he had mentioned, I was asking him like, oh, what kind of music, like is there any new groups that you're really digging right now, like for hip hop or electronic music? And he was saying, yeah, he had really got into Aphex Twin, who's one of my favorite artists, and I was very much familiar with his stuff, and I've been steeped in his like whole world for a very long time and continue to be. He's always been one of my favorite artists. And then he mentioned this other group called Run the Jewels, which was a hip hop group, and at the time they had just kind of, I think, put out their first album. They'd been around for maybe 7 or 8 years, and then so I was like, oh, Run the Jewels. I never heard of that. I was like, that's a cool name. And then I remember, I don't know when it was like around that time, within that year or so, I started to check them out. I found some of their videos on YouTube and listened to some of their stuff online. And my first impression of it was like, okay, it's cool. Like I liked it. I thought it was pretty solid, but I wasn't like, I don't know, I wasn't like enthralled with it. I wasn't blown away by it. I wasn't like, you know, making plans to buy their albums. I thought it was good. I thought it was solid. I thought it was cool. But I wasn't like blown away by it. And and then time went by. I kind of kind of forgot about them for a while, and then just like, I think it was, yeah, not this summer, the summer before. I don't know, it was a pretty random thing or something. I was on YouTube. A lot of the times when I search out new music, and also the same goes for films, a lot of the times when I search out new things, I'll, do online searches for things. There's all this new stuff that's always popping up, so I'm usually checking out a lot of new music and new content online. And I think it was pretty random, but Run the Jewels came up again, and it was like a live concert or something that they were doing. And I remember watching it, and I was like, suddenly I was just like, wow, like this is killer stuff. Like I was totally into it. And then I think the following weekend, or maybe within those few days, I I was at Bull Moose Music, my favorite shop to go to, and I made it a point to go find some Run the Jewels albums. I wanted to buy some Run the Jewels albums, and then I bought two of their albums when I was there, and I was totally fucking blown away by how great it was. Both albums, especially the newer one, the more recent one that came out about a year ago. And I was just like, holy crap, this is awesome. Like, I loved the production. I thought it was really innovative hip hop. I thought it had all these cool elements that I haven't really heard in hip hop at all, or really before. I thought it combined all these really cool elements of electronica, some ambient stuff, and it had this really kind of dark, gritty vibe to it. And it had a little bit of a social, political vibe to it, or it very much did. Kind of in the vein of like Public Enemy. And I was just like, this is badass. Like, this is really great. And since then, now they're like my favorite hip hop group right now as far as new groups go. Like, they're my jam. And it's funny. So all this time went by, and I was like, oh, they're pretty good. And then now it's evolved to where I listen to them all the time, and I think they're just amazing. And then for movies, like an example of a movie thing around that is like I remember going to the theater a long time ago to see that movie with Vincent D'Onofrio and Jennifer Lopez, and it was this film called The Cell. And I saw that in the theater, and I really liked that movie. I thought it was super trippy. Um, really, a really interesting narrative or story about essentially about a serial killer and then also the investigation to try to capture this guy. And it was really uh, a, when I first saw it in the theater, I thought it was a real unnerving, creepy experience. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. I actually liked. I had seen a few films by that by the director and who had directed The Cell, and I liked a lot of his films. And it was directed by Tarsim Singh, who is a director from I think he's from India or Bangladesh, but he's done some really cool movies. Um, and I had seen a few of those, and he always has this real visual thing to his films. He he came from the video world. He made a lot of music videos, so a lot of his kind of aesthetics that he used in his films were very, very visual oriented. And I always, love that kind of thing about his. He did this one movie called The Fall and The Immortals, which is actually an awesome movie. Mirror Mirror, Selfless, which is actually a really interesting movie. Emerald City, but he did a bunch of movies around that time, and I was familiar with his work, and I was excited to see The Cell, and I really liked that. I thought it was super dark and creepy, and I had a good experience. I remember when that came out, and that came out quite a few years ago. And then I don't know. Fast forward many years ago, many years later, I saw it. I think I rented it at Opera House Video. I was kind of craving to see it because I didn't own it, and I watched it. And I was like, yeah, this movie's great, And by that time, I was even more familiar with the director's work, and I was, I was like, yeah, this guy's a really great director, Tarsim Singh, and then just fairly recently, I was at Goodwill, and they had The Cell. I saw The Cell was they were selling it there for like super cheap, and it was like $2 or something, and it was like a collector's edition on DVD. So I bought it, and it had been quite a few years, probably like 5 or 6 years since I'd seen it, and then I watched it, and I had this totally weird reaction. I was just like, I don't know, like it didn't resonate with me as much. And then I was like, well, maybe I was in a weird mood because I remember really loving this movie. And then a week or two later I watched that movie. I watched it again, and then I thought, no, this movie is kind of a piece of crap. I didn't really like it at all. Like I thought visually it was still powerful, and I loved Vincent D'Onofrio as an actor. I really like Vince Vaughn. Jennifer Lopez, she's okay, but Vincent D'Onofrio I love. I think he's great, and I thought the visual thing was great. But I thought, man, the acting is it's terrible, and Jennifer Lopez is just awful in the movie, and I could not get into the movie at all. And then suddenly I was just like, I don't know what I was thinking. Like this movie is so overly hyped and so overly rated, and now I can't really watch that movie. It's like I don't really like it. I don't know what it is. I think it's mainly around the acting and Jennifer Lopez's, her character, and the story itself was like kind of ridiculous, and visually it's powerful, but yeah. So it's always a funny thing of like how that happens in that whole process. So that was the centerpiece of Matthew's show when he talked about when I first checked out his show, and he was doing a podcast on The Thing to see, see if a classic or a movie that you really love still holds the test of time. So when I was a guest on his show, we talked, mostly about movies. We did talk about music stuff, but we mostly talked about film oriented kinds of things, particularly around this channel and my Instagram page that I have and Facebook and all those kinds of things. But one of the movies we did talk a lot about was John Carpenter's The Thing, and how for me that's my favorite film of all time. And I was talking about, we were talking about how that movie just still resonates and is still just as powerful, if not more powerful now when you watch it. The level of paranoia around that film, and the like how claustrophobic that film is. You feel like you're in this small little box with these men that are trying to, survive and potentially are all like gonna kill each other. Just incredible. And I was talking about The Thing, and I brought up, kind of the other films that are in, because it's kind of a franchise to a degree. There are, there's three movies in the franchise, if you want to call it. It's really is a franchise technically when it's a group of movies, and there's three movies in the franchise, and it's based on a short story, Who Goes There, the original movie. And so I kind of went into talking about that also. The main thing was that, it was about John Carpenter's The Thing. But the movie that I talked about a little bit more is this one right here, Howard Hawks' version. He wrote and produced this film with James Arness as the monster. And I absolutely love this movie. And it's hard to believe this came out in 1951, but I think this is like one of the definitive sci-fi movies of all time. I kind of consider it in the B world a little bit, just because it is a low production kind of a film, and it's a little bit campy, but it's so great. It's such a classic movie. And the thing is that as much as I love Carpenter's movie, which I think is the greatest film of his career, and definitely in this group of films, this movie also has a high level of suspense and that level of paranoia of these scientists being trapped essentially in this one central location in the middle of the Arctic. And there's this level of paranoia. James Arness is pretty fantastic. I think he is pretty terrifying, actually, as the monster in this film. This really is an awesome movie. This was a movie I grew up watching. I saw this. I've seen this movie so many freaking times. Probably, I didn't see. I saw John Carpenter's version, in the 80s. I think I saw it shortly after it came out, and it scared the crap out of me. But growing up, my dad is into a lot of science fiction movies, and this was one of his movies, and my mom's also into horror and science fiction. But my dad is a little bit more into, like, he likes horror, but not so much. He has a little bit of a thing against horror. It sometimes bothers him, but he really loves science fiction. And The Thing was a movie that he used to always watch when I was a kid. And The Day the Earth Stood Still, that was another one, another sci-fi classic. Those two movies I grew up watching as a kid, and this one I had seen before the John Carpenter version, and I was, during that time I was a very, very little kid, so a lot of this stuff was, over my head, but these films were still really terrifying, particularly John Carpenter's film. And this was my introduction to the story, and the short story that it's based on, Who Goes There, is pretty amazing. And this, but John Carpenter's version actually goes. I think it pays a little bit more. It's maybe closer to the book, I think, but this is such a classic. And to believe that this came out in 1951 is just, I just think it's awesome and amazing, and just, it was directed by Christian Nyby. The screenplay, like I said, was by Howard Hawks. Howard Hawks was a pretty, iconic legend in Hollywood. He was mostly known as a film director. Uh, I mean, so many movies to his credit. He made the original Scarface, Rio Brava in 1959, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, 53, El Dorado, Bringing Up Baby in 1938, The Big Sleep, To Have and to Hold. I mean, so many films. He was like an iconic, you know, director. But he did not direct this movie, which is really weird because I always assumed that he directed this film, and I just really realized that he didn't direct it, and it was just his. Uh, he only was involved with this film as a producer, and as a writer. Christian Nyby directed it, and I just kind of realized that, which is really funny. And Christian Nyby was a television director, which is wild. Um, 1967, he directed Fight to Flight or First to Flight, which is a war movie from 1967, um, and he was mostly involved with television. Young Fury, 1965, Operation CIA, The Hitchhiker, uh, Hell on Devils, Rawhide. He directed Rawhide. That's wild. That was a real famous Bonanza, the series. He directed Bonanza. Huh. Wild. So yeah, Christian Nyby. But this movie, if you haven't seen this Howard Hawks version, you've got to see. If you're a fan of science fiction and horror, this is, one of the, I think, most iconic movies out there. Like this is like part of that. This was a pivotal movie that helped shape horror and science fiction, particularly science fiction. This is like one of the iconic movies. Like this is one of the bases, one of the movies that created the base for the entire genre. I think you have other films that I feel are up there too in the sci-fi genre. I haven't done too many sci-fi movies lately for this channel, which is weird because I love sci-fi. I want to get more into this. I have quite a few sci-fi movies, but movies that I think, just off the top of my head, that are kind of the foundation to science fiction and to that created this genre, made it so strong and popular, and has led to so many other movies. Uh, the movies that I can think of that are definitely part of that is definitely The Thing. This movie right here from 1951. I think another movie would be The Day the Earth Stood Still. That's an amazing film, an amazing classic. I unfortunately only own this on DVD, which I got to get on Blu-ray, but this is a pretty cool edition. Um, I think other films, Forbidden Planet. I think that's another movie that I think is one of the greatest sci-fi movies ever. I have that on Blu-ray. I'm gonna eventually do a show on that. That to me is one of the king B movie exploitation sci-fi movies ever. I think another movie that is kind of essential to this group of films, would be Logan's Run. I really love that movie. I think that movie is just incredible. Uh, yeah, there's so many great ones that I feel that came before many other films and kind of established as far as you know the genre of horror of sci-fi films. I think this that is like those are definitely like the essential movies that people should check out, and I feel like those are the that's the foundation of this whole genre. Just amazing. And again, to think that this came out in 1951, so ahead of its time. Again, it's filled with just really great suspense and a level of paranoia and great characters, um, great ending, and just you feel like you're in that scenario with these actors. It's just a masterpiece. There's a third version or a third film in the franchise of The Thing, which is like a prequel. And I talked about that on the podcast too. And I think it's worth, you know, for the most part, I think it's worth for people to probably check out. But it's not great. It's nowhere near as good as the other ones in a lot of ways, and it's mostly due to the overabundance and the use of like the CGI thing, and kind of the story itself. The tension kind of gets let out of that balloon, especially the second or third act. From an effects standpoint, like with this film and especially John Carpenter's film, the use of practical effects is so effective, and it's you're just seeing these guys create this stuff, just from a from a purely from organic materials. There's no CGI, there's no computer generated things, and I do like or love CGI when it's used right, or there's a cool balance. But I feel like this film, and especially John Carpenter's film, are really great on just capturing that, and how the imagination is can be so powerful, and be such a tool for creating movies, but then also as a viewer. And with the third one, it kind of goes off the rails where they start incorporating lots of CGI, and it really takes you out of the story. I talked about that in the movie. On some levels, the movie is interesting because it follows the case of the Norwegian expedition that first discovers the UFO, the craft, that is a big part of John Carpenter's movie. The interesting thing too is a lot of the times when I've seen interviews with John Carpenter, especially around the thing, he always brings up this movie and just says what an amazing film this was, and how he always looked at this as being one of the iconic movies, and always thought Howard Hawks was an amazing director. I tried to emulate it, but then obviously did something very, very different with his own film. So, and he always like talks about how much he was enamored with this film and Howard Hawks as a director. Just really great. So yeah, The Thing, 1951. If you're a fan of sci-fi horror, this is one of the must-see movies. It's a classic, one of the greats. I think without this film and also those other sci-fi movies I mentioned, movies that kind of came out in the 50s and 60s, I think science fiction has obviously has evolved to where it's a massive genre now. But I feel without these films, particularly this one, in that canon, or as if it wasn't part of that base, the I think sci-fi would be very different. I think the genre itself of science fiction films and horror would be probably a different thing. It would be a different landscape. It would probably look a lot differently, and it might not even be as good. So, yeah, please check this out if you get a chance. This is Jason Dean. So thanks again for your support. If you like this channel, please like and subscribe to it, and leave a comment. I love chatting it up with folks, other film fanatics. So thanks again. Peace. Have a great day.